Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, July and August 1944, 982 refugees are traveling from Europe headed for Fort Ontario, which is in upstate New York, just a little north of Syracuse on Lake Ontario, if you know that region. We've talked on this show about a few other key moments of refugees from the Holocaust making their way or not making their way to the United States. We talked about the plan, which didn't come to fruition, to take refugees to Alaska. We've talked about the so-called Voyage of the Damned, a ship in 1939 full of refugees that was refused entry in Cuba, then the United States and Canada, and ultimately had to return to Europe. But today's story is about refugees who would arrive in the United States at Fort Ontario. This would turn out to be the only large group of Holocaust refugees who were permitted to enter the United States through World War II. Our special guest for this episode is filmmaker Sarah Botstein, who has for years worked closely with Ken Burns and Lynn Novick. And Sarah was the co-director and producer of the series they did, the truly excellent series called The United States and the Holocaust. Sarah, thanks for making the time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This is a really fun show, and all of our friends were really excited. So a lot of people are tuning in. Yeah.
And you told us just before you started, can I out you here? You told us just before you started recording that you just got nominated for an Emmy for this series. So congratulations. I can see the glow.
Thank you.
So, and here, of course, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello. Not yet Emmy nominated, but who knows what the future holds.
What the future will hold.
Hey there, never will be Emmy nominated.
So say never.
We want to give a shout out to listener Christian, who suggested this episode, and apparently Christian tells us that he did his senior thesis at SUNY Oswego on this very topic. So there you go. Your senior thesis can be the topic of a future podcast episode.
But Sarah, of reaching for the stars.
Exactly.
I know.
But Sarah, one of the things your film did so well for me, and I think was one of the reasons that a lot of people responded to it, was that it kind of reframed in many ways the conversation and debate taking place here in the United States about what was happening in Europe, specifically around the Holocaust. And I think that there's this kind of story that maybe we learn in history class, that we tell ourselves that the U.S. didn't really know how bad things were until close to the end of the war. But you show that from the beginning there was a lot of information and a lot of debate and a kind of real clarity in many ways about the tragedy that was unfolding. So, can you paint that picture and then specifically start to talk about how the question of refugees fit into that?
Yeah, it's really a central, important question, actually, to why we decided ultimately to make this film. I think Ken, Lynn, and I all came to this subject, along with our writer, Jeff Ward, for similar and different reasons. And for me personally, when we first decided to make a film about the U.S. response to the Holocaust, I actually was a little bit nervous to do another Holocaust project. There have been so many books written, so many exhibitions, so many documentaries made. What would be new about telling this story? And the exhibition at the Holocaust Museum in D.C., which is called Americans in the Holocaust, was really looking at these central questions. What did Americans know? When did we know it? And what did we think about it? Polling was relatively new at the time. And so there was a lot of data and questioning and thought about how people were responding, and then trying to make statistics out of that. So one of the things we like to tell ourselves is that we didn't actually know a lot about what was going on. And starting in 1933, as the Nazis were coming to power, American newspapers were reporting this pretty consistently. Sometimes it was on the front page, sometimes it wasn't. An event like Kristallnacht was on the front page of every newspaper in the country. The idea that we didn't really understand what was going on is just not true. Did we see all the evidence and all the photographs? No, but we did know that there was a crisis, and that there was going to be a burgeoning refugee crisis. And the reason I think that's important to think about in 2023 is we are continually having this debate in America about immigration, refugees, what kind of a nation are we? Are we a land for the oppressed to build a better life? Until 1924, you could pretty much walk across the border from Canada or Mexico. You could come from Europe with a landing card and make a life here. And what the 1924 Immigration Act, which set up these interesting quotas and changed how hard it was to get here, is the beginning of what we see now every time we have an election, every time there's a political question, this notion of what is America's role in accepting or refusing refugees, and how do we think about that? So, yes, we knew what was going on, and the polling consistently in the beginning, in the middle, and much more devastating in 1945, when we had seen all the evidence, when we knew what had happened, the largest refugee crisis in 20th century history. What did Americans say? No.
All of this is just so mind-boggling to me, because you think of the Statue of Liberty, you think of this emblem of give me your tired, your poor, and all the while, the United States has no refugee policy at all. All we had was the 1924 Immigration Act, which was, you said interesting, I say racist. Yeah. They were not allowing in Jews, Asians, Africans into the country. And the quota, the cap, was only about 150,000 immigrants that could come into the country, which is not a lot.
Yeah. Well, and it's such an important story because of the way Americans conceive of World War II and their role in it. We often, sort of contrast World War I and World War II. World War I was kind of the bad war that didn't make any sense, that didn't have a purpose. But World War II was so clear. Here was good, here was evil. Americans were on the side of good, and were fighting these evil forces. And you throw in the story of U.S. refugee non-policy, and it starts to complicate that story in some pretty serious ways.
Exactly. Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to unpack this three ways. So, one, I think we have to put anti-Semitism into the conversation about racism, xenophobia, the fear of the other, and try to understand this tension in American history, a la the Statue of Liberty, of are we a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country, or are we a nation of Catholics, Blacks, Jews? Okay, so that's one question. And 1924 is that decade's answer to that question, which is racist and xenophobic and really devastating. Then there's the interesting economic argument about immigration, which always gets thrown into this conversation. I can find no evidence when immigrant populations don't make our economy stronger. So why does that argument keep happening? Makes no sense. We're a country that needs more jobs. This is a great population to have help us with our very complex labor crisis. So that's also fascinating. And then the way we teach World War II, I think, is sort of tragic. We teach it as this greatest generation moment where we absolutely saved the world from fascism and are to be greatly rewarded for that. But there's a war happening in the Pacific, there's a war happening in Europe, and there's a humanitarian crisis. And they are taught separately when they need to be braided together. And Roosevelt really understood, I have a military crisis and I have a humanitarian crisis. And I have to message to my public and to my Congress very carefully about both those things so that we can succeed militarily and do as much as we can on the humanitarian crisis, which he fails to do. His administration could have done more, and they didn't. There is no question about that. But he is aware and understands the country's temperature for, or its appetite for, an anti-Semitic, racist Southern. The Southern Democrats are powerful.
Yeah. Given all that, I mean, given that this refugee question is being sort of understood within the context of a decades old and very flawed law to begin with, and all of the kind of anti-Semitism that you paint a picture of in the film and just described there. But how much also is the refugee question seen as, for lack of a better word, I guess, like a question of entanglement in this war in Europe? Was there part of the administration that was saying, if we take on refugees, it will be taking a step towards getting involved in a war that we're very reluctant to get involved in? Absolutely.
Think about Charles Lindbergh. America first, isolationism. After the war to end all wars, Nicole, to your point, World War I was absolutely devastating. We hunkered down. We had the Depression. We're not going to get entangled in foreign affairs. We are just not going to do that. It's very hard to put ourselves back to that moment. But Charles Lindbergh was the most popular American other than Franklin Roosevelt, and he absolutely did not want to get entangled in a foreign war.
And we often, when we teach the 1920s and 1930s, we talk about this, right? That Americans had little appetite for war, that there had to be a concerted campaign to get Americans involved in this war. And then, of course, it takes until Pearl Harbor for the U.S. to actually fully enter the war. But there were also Americans who were ringing the bells, who were raising the alarms, who were saying, not just the stuff that was being reported in the New York Times, but who were saying the destruction of the Jews is happening in Germany. This is a crisis that America cannot sit on the sidelines for. And for years, almost a decade, they were kind of Cassandras who were constantly saying this is happening. And yet there was not a policy answer to meet it, in part because of this just deeply ingrained anti-Semitism, xenophobia, America for Americans attitude.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
But even amongst the anti-Semitism, when they started to do polls, they found that 70% of Americans approved of the idea of having some sort of temporary protection for refugees that were being persecuted by the Nazis. So maybe people didn't have consensus about like how that or what that would look like. But the idea of having, some sort of refuge for people, I think people could get on board with that.
Although I think that there is this kind of tension, and we see it still today, between what is popular, especially on the humanitarian front, and what people who hold the levers of power are willing to give. Like, they weren't willing to change the quotas. And that kind of brings us back to this story of what was happening at Fort Ontario, which is you eventually have these 982 refugees come to the United States. We'll talk about this more, but they come to the United States marked as luggage, and they are there as personal guests of Franklin Roosevelt, which is the only way that they can get in around these quota policies. The quota policies aren't changed for this refugee crisis, regardless of what popular polling said.
And they're put in barracks with barbed wire. Photographs and the footage of Fort Ontario is really fascinating. Mm-hmm. I think 1944 is a very important year for America in two bright ways. If we can just talk a lot about what we did wrong in terms of the humanitarian crisis and failing the fleeing European Jewry, but we did. In 1944, when we actually were engaged in the war, Roosevelt did create the War Refugee Board and brought the nearly 1,000 to Oswego. So those are two things that he did do, and they were eventually allowed to stay here.
But the War Refugee Board, which was, his kind of workaround of the Immigration Act, largely was about, the U.S. helping refugees find homes in allied countries, but not come to the United States, right? It wasn't exactly flinging open the doors. So I'm just curious kind of if you have a sense of why this particular group in this particular place in this particular moment when, going all the way back to that Voyage of the Damned story, it felt like over and over it was the United States trying to find ways to just not ultimately let people step onto actual U.S. soil.
I don't know the technical answer for that. I know Eleanor Roosevelt was very involved and very committed to getting them here. I think it was maybe an experimental example to show what could be done that wasn't going to harm or hurt a community or a population, but ultimately maybe make it stronger.
But I think it's interesting, even like the caveats that are put on, like, so to be in full disclosure, there's 3,000 people that apply. There's about 1,000 people that get accepted. There are parameters around that 1,000. You couldn't be a man of military age. You couldn't have any contagious diseases. Thankfully, they weren't separating families, which was a part of the deal. But for the most part, you're thinking about women, children, and elderly people that are coming in. Not everyone is Jewish. There are some people who are Catholic and some people who are Orthodox, but it's just interesting to me that like who gets to come in, I think is still really telling about how we allow ourselves to sort of have empathy for other people.
And moreover, they were asked to sign statements pledging to return to Europe when the war ended, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, it was such a limited thing. But I do think, kind of in answer to the question of why now, there is something that's happening in 1944 where it does seem... Again, the door doesn't get flung open. The door gets cracked open just a little bit. But it takes until 1944. And by then, Americans know that at least 1 million Jews have died in Europe, even though it was much, much larger number. Like, there is a growing open discussion and recognition that is taking place, that there's something truly catastrophic happening, and that reality is sinking in a way that is changing the political calculations for Roosevelt. Again, not revolutionizing them, but changing them just enough that you can have this experiment. And, in June of 1944, D-Day happens, which changes sort of the direction that the war is going. But there's a lot of war left, and Americans don't know at that time. Franklin Roosevelt doesn't know at that time that the war is going to end in a year. So it's not yet clear how much longer this is going to go on. So this could be an experiment that might turn into something else in 45, 46, 47. But of course it doesn't. The war ends. And again, Americans don't become much more open to refugees then either.
I think that's a good way to think about it. I mean, at the end of the day, anti-Semitism was very, very real. And he was very, very conscious of that. And so even when they were on the ground in Europe and he was messaging to the troops what they were fighting for and what they were going toward, it was framed, about democracy and fascism, not about a genocide.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So with Fort Ontario specifically, this group, they as we mentioned, it's a select group that comes to the United States. They're inside of a camp, basically. Many of them are mostly working at the mess hall and on the fort itself. A few people are allowed to do, labor outside of the camp, and a few had office jobs. And, the legacy of this, I mean, there's one quote I'm struck by by a man who was 19 at the time in the camp. But, he basically talks about how he and his group were used. He said, I feel we were used by Roosevelt. He was a good president, but he was coming up for re-election, and I think he just did what he did with us to show that he was doing something for the Jews, to check a box and then move on. And I mean, I'm just curious, Sarah, if you have a sense of where, I mean, you've talked a lot about kind of Roosevelt's particular calculus, but in this moment in 44, what do you think he is up to here? Does he genuinely feel like the U.S. can play a refugee role, or is he trying to do something expedient in the way that...
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think Roosevelt was a great politician and he understood his constituents. I think he was also one of the great presidents in American history, and this was not his sharpest, brightest moment in terms of the refugee question and crisis, but he also, were he not able to repeal the Neutrality Acts, we would be in a very, very different conversation. So I never feel comfortable coming down too hard on him. People say, why didn't he do more? And I think, okay, look at our government today. We were way more I mean, the idea that just a president can wave their wand and change the will of the people one way or the other is just not the case in American history. So I think it's probably, Jody, a little bit of both. And the more complicated it gets, the more interesting it is, and the more it's relevant to thinking about today.
And this is the through line of Roosevelt's legacy, right? He does the New Deal, but he leaves African Americans largely out of it. He navigates World War II, but doesn't help Jewish refugees. And so there is this kind of sense that he is working within the political limits of a pretty xenophobic, anti-Semitic, white supremacist society. And he does the best he can, but it means that his legacy is quite mixed.
Yeah, and just think it's the last war that we fight with a segregated army. It's a very, very complicated time culturally. Yeah.
So let's tie up the story of this group that was at Fort Ontario, because they do end up through I guess through a loophole or something, working their way back into the United States. But what's the fate of that specific group?
So it's super interesting. The historian in the film, who's one of my dear friends now, Rebecca Erbelding, who wrote the definitive book on the War Refugee Board, is in the midst of writing a book about this subject. So if you ever really want to dive deep into us, you can talk to her. But there were these wacky laws where if you went to Canada and came back, you could be reclassified. So you could change your papers. And people were very, very clever about those sort of things. And so because you were so close to the Canadian border, you could figure out a way to be able to stay here. At one point when we were making the film, we thought about trying to find people who lived in the community who we could interview to talk about what it was like when all these people came here and all the cameras and the First Lady was there and what did they think of Roosevelt's policy. And I think Becky will include some of that in her book. I think it goes to this question of the clever ways. We used to say this is in some ways a film about paperwork.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. People always ask, what do you think we should do? Make the paperwork easier. You know how hard it is to renew your passport. Imagine you're a refugee and you're trying to get here, and every place you go, you have to have exactly the right piece of paper. So if you go to Canada for a certain amount of time and then you come back here, or you think, I'm a first generation American. My father was born in 1946. My grandparents came here in 1949. My family, the survivors, of which there are very few, some went to Sao Paulo, Brazil. Some went to Mexico City, and my father and his sister and brother and my grandparents got to the Bronx. So paperwork was everything. And you'd have to go to Mexico to be able to come here. You'd go from Port Oswego to Canada to come back there. You'd get, because we had these weird pernicious quotas and people were trying to figure out ways to help. And Canada was a good way to get here.
Yeah. One final little tidbit. The ship on which, these refugees came to the United States was then used to take troops from the U.S. over to France to fight the war. So there you go. That's a nice little exchange, I would say.
Right.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Again, the film from Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and our guest, Sarah Botstein, is The United States and the Holocaust. You should absolutely see it. It touches a little bit on the Fort Oswego story, but there's so much more in there. It's really stunning and now an Emmy nominated. So there you go. But Sarah, thank you so much for doing this. This was really great.
Yeah, really great. Thank you.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.